Dilar Dirik, a PhD researcher and activist of the Kurdish women movement. Women have played a defining role in the Kurdish resistance. In 1987, the Union of the Patriotic Women of Kurdistan aligned with the Kurdish Workers' Party, PKK. This lecture will address the role of the Kurdish women's movement in emancipating the project of national liberation within Kurdistan. Dirik will specifically address how the movement opposes the violence of states, but also that of male patriarchal domination. Understanding the overarching systematic oppression of society as perpetuated by the capitalist, nation-state-oriented, dominant world order has brought the Kurdish women's movement in opposition of the concept of the state. Here, the state is seen as a replication of patriarchal relations, which they believe can only be undermined through principled gendered equality in radical democratic confederalism. Her lecture is entitled Stateless Democracy, How the Kurdish Women Movement Liberated Democracy from the State.
And before I begin, I would like to say that I would like to dedicate this talk to all the revolutionary struggling women all over the world, especially those women that are currently fighting against this disgusting mentality that calls itself the Islamic State. And as you know, Kurdish women are on the forefront of fighting against the Islamic State at the moment. And I would also like to dedicate this talk to 3 revolutionary Kurdish women who were brutally assassinated in the heart of Paris last year. We have been awaiting justice for Sakine, Cansız, Fidan Doğan, and Leyla Şailemez for 1 year, 8 months, and 12 days. They were brutally killed in the heart of Paris. I wish I could start this talk in more hopeful, more happy times, but as you know, and as you have listened to Adem Uzun's lecture yesterday, the people in Kurdistan, Iraq, and Syria, they are currently facing a massacre. As we speak, only in the last 24 hours, more than 70,000 people were displaced, only in the last 24 hours, because they are surrounded by the Islamic State within Syrian borders, the Kurdish regions in Syria. There have been multi-front ISIS attacks, Islamic State attacks, and just a month before that there were attacks on the Yazidi Kurdish community in Şengal or Sinjar, also by the Islamic State. This is happening in front of the eyes of the international community. So I want you to know that I'm talking about the Kurdish women's movement with all that political background. So maybe it will help us understand the value of the Kurdish women's movement better, considering the threat that it is facing at the moment. As you have seen in the mainstream media, which finally picked up the Islamic State, well, first of all, the Islamic State has been around for years, and the Kurds in Syria have been fighting against the Islamic State for 2 years. Nobody cared, okay? Only last month the world paid attention to what is happening because strategically important places were attacked in Iraq. So, and within that context, you saw the emerging role of women, as if Kurdish women were fighting since yesterday. No, Kurdish women have been fighting against several regimes, against the Iranian regime, against the second largest NATO army, Turkey, against Saddam Hussein, and now against both the Syrian regime as well as the Islamic State. But only now people pay attention to it because, you know, they're fighting the Islamic State. How could people, women from such a backward region of the world fight the Islamic State? So, but nobody really asks what are their motivations? What is the political project behind that? What kind of backup do these women have that they so bravely face this threat of the Islamic State while the whole world discusses what to do with it? How do we confront the Islamic State? Well, Kurdish women are actively in the forefront fighting against it, but not because they're so militarily well equipped, no, because they also have an ideology, a better future to look forward to. So even though the situation is extremely intense, and I will try to be not so angry in my speech, but it's impossible considering the current situation, I will try to end with a hopeful note. So why am I talking about the Kurdish women's movement if we're here talking about the state, about national self-determination? What does women's liberation have to do with it? Well, I will start out by giving you a rough outline of the Kurdish women's movement, how it emerged within the national liberation context, and how it eventually moved from the concept of nationalism by realizing the backwardness, the primitiveness of nationalism with all its patriarchal implications, because you know, nationalism is always a preservation of patriarchy. Women are seen as the biological and cultural reproducers of the so-called nation, which is a very masculinized concept. So, but at the same time, they challenge the idea of the state. How can a liberationist movement that started out with the aim of an independent Kurdistan come to reject the state as inherently oppressive and inherently hegemonic, incompatible with real democratic values and with freedom? This is really important, I think. So I will then propose the alternative concept of democratic confederalism as an alternative to the state, which is based on principles such as gender equality, ecology, and radical grassroots democracy. I will elaborate on that. And you can see it in this very beautiful map, and thank you for the designers. So, as I said, one of the core aims of this movement was the challenge to the state with all its capitalist, patriarchal, and nationalist chauvinist implications. So, of course, I mean, we are here with representatives of several stateless nations. We all know how being stateless in the system of nation states makes one extremely vulnerable. That is out of question. You know, when we challenge the state, we must not forget what statelessness also does. But that does not mean that the state is then the answer. Maybe the state is not the answer, the state is the problem. So, as I've said, statelessness makes you vulnerable to genocide, to denial, to oppression and assimilation. I really do not have to elaborate on that. We have seen talks on that. So, and the Kurds as the largest, often referred to as the largest nation without a state, and they are separated over 4 different countries, Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Turkey. They know this very well. They know very well what it means to suffer as a stateless community. So, especially women are affected by this, because apart from the ethnic discrimination, there's also socioeconomic discrimination, and also the patriarchy perpetuated by the state as well as by the own community. But it is the same people, the same women, women and men, but especially women, that realize that the state system may perhaps not be the solution if it causes so many problems. Should we really establish the exact same system if it caused all this oppression, if it caused all these problems to begin with? Maybe it cannot bring you freedom in a meaningful way. Maybe it can give you what everyone else has. It can give you a flag, it can give you something. But is that freedom without social transformation? Especially women know this very well because they have experienced this within their own struggle, within the national liberation struggle, how your own community, even with the claim of emancipation and freedom, can completely compromise your rights. And you have to ask yourself, what kind of liberation is this if it does not care about the rights of 50% of its own community? So, seeing the compromises that were made in the nationalist liberation movements made the Kurdish women's movement take the decision to autonomously organize itself, still affiliated with the liberationist movement, the general movement, but in order to make sure that the women's rights will not be compromised, they organized themselves autonomously as well. And actually, this is a problem that women in several different national liberation movements or revolutionary struggles, socialist struggles face. There's always this promise, once freedom is there, once we have a state, once the colonizer is gone, everyone will be free because we're so much better than them. We have experienced oppression. We will not do the same. That is not the case. In every single place in the world, whenever the oppressor was gone, women sometimes even had fewer rights than before. When Kurdish women have made that experience themselves, there's no need to have any illusions. That is why that discrimination by the own movement made Kurdish women take the decision to organize themselves autonomously. And also, one aim of this was to make sure that people understand women's liberation is not just a rights-based concept, okay? You do not have rights on paper. That does not mean anything if the society has not changed its mentality. And in order to change society's mentality, you cannot put the burden of women's liberation just on women. Women, form your own communities and then get your rights. No. Women's liberation is a core principle for a real understanding of democracy and freedom. So we have seen some talks here as well that address women's issues only in terms of rape. Women are raped. You know, that is not the only problem that women face. Obviously, there's much more to that. There's so many more things that women as subjects face. Anyways, so this autonomous women's organization also came with the general shift in the Kurdish movement, which moved away from the idea of having an independent Kurdistan with clearly determined state borders, to shifting towards this thing that Abdullah Öcalan, the ideological representative of the PKK, who has been imprisoned for 15 years in Turkey, proposes as democratic confederalism. And you see a rather complicated map of this here. Again, thank you for the designer. So what is democratic confederalism? First of all, it wants to be an alternative to the state. Okay, and it is a project that is proposed not only for the Kurds, but for all the peoples in the region, because it acknowledges not only Kurds live in Kurdistan. Okay, so what can you do? How can you live together in peace and democracy, but not just on paper, but in a meaningful way? So they realize, well, what are our problems? Patriarchy, capitalism, the nation state. We need to find alternatives to counter these very oppressive forces. So the main pillars then became gender equality, an active struggle for gender equality, ecology, and grassroots democracy. You see many different things. Collective farming, working cooperatives, and then the council movement is especially very important because what's basically the idea behind the council movement is you decide, the people decide on an issue, and they're all very local. So, well, there's city-level councils, villages, neighborhoods, etc. Then these decisions that were taken are then coordinated through different committees and then enforced. So how do you do that when you have these 4 states around you? The idea is to do that in spite of the existing state structures. Another very important element of the whole organization of democratic confederalism, well, confederalism is the whole idea, the project, but the active steps that are taken are called democratic autonomy. So you create your autonomy in spite of the dominant structures around you. And one of the interesting things there is that a principle of co-presidency is enforced, which means that one woman and one man, regardless of what position, whether this be a party's presidency, there's always 2. A committee, a small village community, 2 people. The same principles are now enforced in the Turkish parliaments. The party that is called the Kurdish party, but it does not call itself Kurdish party. They have co-presidents in their high-level party organizations, as well as in the municipalities. Even though this is not recognized by the state, they do that in spite of what the state wants. So I just want you to understand that the women's movement is an active part of this democratic autonomy movement, but it's also autonomously organized. And why? For example, if you have 2 co-presidents for the, say you vote for a municipality, you have 2 co-presidents. In order to make sure that this woman, who is the co-president, is not a token, just pushed by the men, the women's movement decides who should be the women candidate. So in Turkey, this is due to state oppression very, very difficult to enforce. Because of this system of democratic autonomy, the Declaration of Democratic Autonomy, 10,000 people were put in prison under terrorism charges for advocating separatism from the state by establishing their own schools, their own people's councils, and their own autonomous structures parallel to the state, self-sustained in spite of the state. people were put in prison because of that, and they're still extremely criminalized. Let's turn, though, to the Syrian part of Kurdistan, which is called Rojava. Rojava means west in Kurdish, and so it implies West Kurdistan, the Syrian part of Kurdistan. In 2012, I will not annoy you too much with the details of the war, but in 2012, the regime forces withdrew from the region, which created a vacuum that the Kurds then seized. So what you have basically in the north of Syria, the Kurdish regions, the Kurds now control this area. And what have they done? They have put this system of democratic confederalism into active practice. And they are obviously better able to do that than in Turkey because there is no state to prevent them from it. What happened? There is co-presidency on all levels. There is a 40% women's quota. The first laws that were issued were the criminalization of honor killings, of polygamy, of child marriage, of forced marriage, of domestic violence. Not only the criminalization thereof. Men that issue violence against people, domestic violence, they are not supposed to be part of the administration, and things like that. So you have very interesting kinds of things evolving there. They have a charter for the 3 autonomous cantons that they then eventually declared in 2004, at the beginning of this year. That, I don't want to say integrate, but they cooperate with all the ethnic and religious groups in the region. So they don't call it Kurdistan anymore. They just go by the names of the cantons. So this is Cizre Canton, this is etc. So in the Cizre Canton, actually, which is the most multicultural of the 3 cantons, 30% of the parliament are supposed to be Arabic, 30% Assyrian, 30% Kurds, and the remaining 10% are reserved for other minorities, while 40% have to be women. So it's very interesting what is going on. And in the structures that are created there, many Arabs, many Assyrians have joined them. So this is beyond trying to have this Kurdish-dominated enclave. The people try to make peace and work with the people there together. Last month, in August, I'm sure you have heard of the Islamic State attacks on Iraq, where the Yazidi Kurdish community, which has faced 72 massacres in their history, were massacred by the Islamic State. So what then happened is that Syrian Kurdish forces, Kurds from Syria, crossed the border to Iraq and rescued 10,000 of people. Why the Kurds in Syria? Why not the Kurds in Iraq? The Kurds in Iraq, it is interesting to see the co-optation of certain kinds of movements by larger powers. For example, Iraqi Kurdistan, which itself has a huge history of resistance and oppression under Saddam Hussein, has been co-opted by international powers. It is a booming economy, it is very much capitalist, it's extremely feudal and patriarchal, and it is the only region now that actually claims a state. So that is quite interesting. So, in spite of these claims of independence and accusing the movement affiliated with the PKK, for example, of having given up on independence because they no longer want a state, the forces of the Iraqi Kurdish government, they had to withdraw because they could not sustain themselves. Because they relied so much on external powers, on the international order, to get weapons and military support, that they could not protect their own people. Instead, it was the Kurds from Syria who have been politically and economically marginalized and oppressed by the international community through political and economic embargoes, being excluded from the Geneva II Peace Conference, for example. They were the ones that crossed the border and saved all the people. So it shows us a little bit about how much can this claim to statehood give us independence in a system that in itself does not let you be independent. If we think of the state as the liberator, if we stick to this paradigm that only the state can liberate us, we will end up in this system that completely leaves us dependent on the status quo. Because, why? The state, people then depend on the state, and the state depends on the nation-state system, and the nation-state system of the international order is in the hands of a few states, We know this very well. How many states in the Middle East, even if they are independent on paper, how independent are they really? We should ask ourselves that. So the example of the attacks on the Yazidis, for example, showed it is not a booming economy or international approval that will make you independent in a meaningful way, but self-sustainability, your grassroots organization, your support of the people, your cooperation with others, rather than isolating yourself through state borders, that will give you a real, meaningful concept of independence and autonomy and self-determination. So, in a way, the operation in Shengal was democratic confederalism in practice, because the people did not recognize these borders. They said, we will cross the border to save the people. So, in this sense, this is not a shift away from independence. This is a more meaningful independence. So, I will slowly come to the conclusion. Well, I think the example of Rojava, I wish I had the Western Syrian Kurdistan. I wish I had more time to elaborate on it, but it does show us in practice that in spite of economic and political embargoes, in spite of attacks by the Islamic State, how the people there, Kurds, Assyrians, Arabs, all cooperate together jointly, shows us, yes, very well, this is possible, and the people, parallel to this existential war that they lead against ISIS, at the same time create women's academies, schools, cooperatives. This is not a utopia. People in Rojava, in Syrian Kurdistan, are trying to live that. And it is that system that is now under attack by the Islamic State, but before it was attacked by international marginalization. Why were they not allowed to attend with a small delegation in Geneva too? Why? Why are there political and economic embargoes on Syrian Kurdistan? If the people cooperate there together, if women are on the forefront. So I think we need to ask ourselves, how do we understand independence and self-determination? Is this possible within the parameters of the state? How can we, if this state system itself implies so much dependence on the status quo, which created this Third World War? It is the Third World War in everything, we just don't call it that. Through global arms trade, through politics based on interest, endorsed by state structures, and the international system also only operates through states, only states have the power to decide. But I want to ask you, the people here in the room who have a state, how independent are you? Were you asked by your government whether they should go on war in the Middle East, in Africa? Did you decide that? No, I don't think so. So what does independence mean? Can we really achieve it through the state? Or should we not work towards organizing ourselves in a grassroots level? So, this sounds very utopic, but this is what is happening. While the international order is discussing how to deal with the Islamic State, it is Kurdish women actually fighting it. It is Kurdish people who have saved the Yazidis, while 2 days later, Americans sent aid, which didn't even reach most of the people. They taught the international community a lesson in humanitarian aid, and it showed the existing state systems or the emerging states what independence actually means. It means you do not need approval to save people. It means you do not need to get help or whatever if you want to do something, especially when ISIS is on your front. You do not need bureaucratic approval from anyone if you're really independent. So we should ask ourselves, is this the right way? Is the parameter of the state really the platform on which we should found our idea of independence? Or should we not try to change the system? Yes, statelessness makes you vulnerable, but the problem is the state. We cannot wait for a liberation that may never even come. We have to act here and now. And I think this is the strength of the Kurdish women's movement, because what they have done every time is not wait for the male members of the party to approve something. No, they have gone ahead with it. They did not wait for the Turkish state to approve of the principle of co-presidency. They just did it anyways. They did not wait for anything. You just created here and now. When ISIS was attacking Kobani, which is now under attack, a few months ago, they did not wait for weapons. Women, 50, 60-year-old women, created their autonomous battalion. They armed themselves, old grandmothers, to fight against the Islamic State. When Geneva II took place, the Kurds were not invited. On the same day, what did they do? They declared 3 autonomous cantons, while the international order was supposedly trying to find a solution to the crisis. So I think while the world is discussing what to do with ISIS, as I said, Kurdish women are doing it. And they are not doing it in isolation, they work with the people. So I think the state, if you think only of your own independence, if you only think of what kind of borders can I create, you isolate yourself. You cannot. If the whole system around you is so flawed, if there is a war zone, you will not have freedom in isolation. This will not be freedom, this will be complete instability. You have to work with the people in the region. You have to move beyond these state borders that were imposed on you in the first place, and you should not try to seek legitimacy from that. You can wait and wait and wait, and it will never come. You have to act now, and you have to start now. So I think basically people deserve better than this, and as I've said, independence is a very broadly defined concept, and we should make sure that it is a meaningful one in order for us to keep going from there. And lastly, the Islamic State has, I'm concluding, the Islamic State has launched an explicit war on women. Okay, this is very important to note. They use systematically sexual violence as a tool of war. People just ignore that. They say, oh, these women are raped. They do that on purpose. They exploit the existing concept of honor in the region, the existing patriarchal structures, to launch these attacks on women. Okay? So the Kurdish women's movement has the strength to also counter this mentality by organizing autonomously, because ISIS is everything, the complete opposite of what the women's movement stands for. It is a war on women, it is a feminicide. So I want to conclude. I think the biggest threat to the status quo is not yet another state. It is the self-determined, organized, mobilized, grassroots organization of the peoples with each other in these regions that are so oppressed by the hegemonic status quo. And that is much more dangerous to the system. And even more dangerous to the system than that, I'm not talking about the Middle East only, everywhere in the world, is the organized, mobilized, conscious woman. We should not forget that, because women's liberation is a central core to understanding what kind of democracy and freedom are you talking about. So I just want to conclude by once again saluting the people that are now in active resistance against this kind of system, against the ultra-patriarchal system of ISIS, which is just a more extreme form of violence that women everywhere face anyways. So I want to end with a Kurdish slogan. It is Berhudan Jiane. It means resistance is life. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dilar.